Welcome to the DVERT Brief. I'm Dr. Meg McBride, Director of the Domestic Violent Extremism Research and Translation Center at CNA. This podcast series highlights new research, trends, and findings on violent extremism in America. Designed for policymakers, practitioners, and anyone curious about the evolving domestic threat landscape, this AI-generated podcast delivers concise and accessible summaries of our latest work. Thanks for listening.
In today's episode, we'll be exploring key insights from our report, BTAM, Building a Shared Understanding. Let's dive in.
I want to start with a story that really frames this conversation. After the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007, investigators found that multiple people, faculty, students, others, had observed concerning behaviors beforehand.
Right, but critically, no one connected the dots. Information existed across different parts of the system, but it wasn't effectively shared or understood.
And part of the issue was that people interpreted laws and policies, especially around privacy, differently, which made them hesitant or unsure about sharing information.
Exactly. And that kind of breakdown isn't just a historical lesson. It's something that still shows up today in efforts to prevent targeted violence.
So to understand how that plays out in practice, let's look at how multidisciplinary prevention efforts actually function on the ground. The findings in this report come from a year-long evaluation of targeted violence prevention efforts in Wood County, Ohio. The research team interviewed 34 professionals across different sectors: schools, mental health services, law enforcement, and criminal justice. When you bring together that many disciplines, you get a lot of expertise, but also a lot of different training, frameworks, and ways of thinking about risk and intervention.
Which sounds like a strength, but also potentially a challenge.
Exactly. And two key challenges really stood out: differences in terminology and differences in threat assessment models.
Let's start with terminology. What does that look like in practice?
Different fields use the same terms in very different ways. Take the word assessment, for example. For a mental health professional, that might mean a clinical evaluation, understanding someone's psychological state. For law enforcement, it could mean assessing the risk that someone will carry out violence.
So even when people think they're aligned, they might actually be talking past each other.
Exactly. In fact, in several cases, school administrators incorrectly referred to a clinical forensic psychological evaluation obtained for a student as a behavioral threat assessment, even though those are distinct processes with different purposes.
Wow. That kind of miscommunication or confusion could inform some poor decisions.
Absolutely. Another example is the idea of safety. Schools or law enforcement may require a determination that someone is safe before returning to school, but clinicians often hesitate to make absolute guarantees like that.
That's really interesting. It highlights how different professional lenses shape how people think about risk. Okay, let's move beyond language now and look at the issue of different frameworks for assessing threats.
Yes, not all schools or agencies use the same approach, although many schools use the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines, or CSTAG. Others use the National Threat Assessment Center, NTAC model, or an informal self-developed approach. And while some providers reported being knowledgeable about both formal models, most received training on only one.
What does that mean for collaboration?
Having multiple threat assessment models within one county creates a real language barrier between schools, mental health providers, law enforcement, and the justice system, making it difficult to interpret reports, communicate clearly, and share critical information, especially as students move between schools and services. In some cases, agencies are reluctant to collaborate across models, limiting the support available to students. These differences also make it harder to build shared data systems or consistent guidance at the county and state levels.
Is there consistent guidance at the state level for what counties should do?
No, while Ohio state law mandates that educators receive threat assessment training, there are 22 approved programs to choose from. The content and quality of these programs vary. Some use the CSTAG model, some use the NTAC model, and some are just videos explaining what threat assessment is with no instruction on how to actually conduct one.
That definitely complicates things. So what should practitioners do to address these challenges?
One important step is deliberate coordination, understanding which BTAM models are being used across a community and making sure practitioners can interpret and work across them. Stakeholders should consider making a quick reference guide for practitioners to facilitate this.
So building fluency, not necessarily forcing uniformity.
Exactly. Another key piece is not assuming that everyone has a shared understanding. Teams need space to clarify terminology, ask questions, and align their perspectives.
That sounds simple, but it probably requires intentional effort.
It does. Regular collaboration, whether through meetings, workshops, or shared resources, can help build that common language over time. And that, in turn, strengthens both communication and trust.
It's interesting. This all comes back to something very fundamental: how people communicate.
It does. You can have strong policies and good intentions, but if people don't understand each other, the system can't function effectively.
And in this context, that could mean missing critical opportunities to prevent violence.
Exactly. Connecting the dots requires more than information. It requires shared understanding.
This podcast was produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence tools, but the content was based on research done by the DVERT Center, which is housed within CNA, a nonprofit research and analysis organization dedicated to advancing the safety and security of the nation. The research on which this podcast is based was supported by the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate. Adaptation of this research for the DVERT Brief is supported by the National Institute of Justice under Award Number 15, PNIJ 24-D K00750-D OMR. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of DHSS&T or the Department of Justice.